I define Solarpunk as the concept of this optimistic future, right? You change the medium you design, actually. You don't design the software so it changes people. You design the medium for people to change their way to interact together. So I have like 5 principles that I extracted from Solarpunk. So the first one is to design scaffolds for growth and diversity.
Hey, this is Experience Design Podcast, and I'm your host V, and today I'm talking to a serial guest on this podcast, I guess. That's probably a right title, but it's Kevin Richard, and we talked with Kevin on several different topics, from strategic design to multi-ocean strategy framework. But today we're going to deep dive into Solarpunk and the futures, alternative futures, sustainable futures. What does that actually mean? How does, I guess, the idea of Solarpunk could influence UX designers, service designers, anyone who designs, basically, to think a bit greener, but in the right terms. And this is exactly what we're going to explore in this episode. We're also going to discuss some principles, some tactical elements to this. If you enjoyed this session, what helps most is if you could share it with a friend, just to spread the good conversations around. Why Solarpunk? And why did you get so, I guess, obsessed with it?
So I think I have to explain how I came to Solarpunk and how I came to explore it. So at the beginning of this year, I was working on a project we discussed together. It's a multi-ocean strategy framework, and we wanted to merge 2 movements together, like the strategic design, approach and systemic design approaches. So the 2 are kind of living their life on their side, and we wanted to put them together. And by accident, I discovered like Solarpunk while I was investigating systemic design and some other trends like regenerative design and transition design. And this is how I discovered the term and said, oh, it's interesting. I never heard this term before. So I started to look for, either books on that or research papers or art movements and stuff like that. And 5 months later, I wrote an article about it. And I didn't reach the point where I feel like I really covered everything that would be covered with the subject. We will discuss it a bit, but because there's 2 main ways to understand Solarpunk, at least to me, that are quite different in what they allow us to do. One of the way of understanding it as a concept, for instance, as a concept of what should be the future. There's a lot of variations, but you can make sense of it and say like this some kind of boundaries to what it is, and it could be more or less clearly defined, right? There's another approach which is a bit more like what we could call an assemblage of themes and narratives that are constantly evolving and that are more into the present than just like a proposition. And this part is actually still changing. And it can be like a lens to understand some social movements, for instance. There's still elements that I can learn from it today, and especially how you translate that to the design process or to a design process.
I guess you did almost like a strategic design research project, right? Like you kind of build up the knowledge from what exists and kind of drew some stuff. And that's why I wanted to talk to you, because one of your articles was focused on why is it relevant for UX designers specifically,
Yes.
or like tech. There's a lot of interesting themes, but kind of to pull back a bit, because I think a lot of people are going to listen and they don't know what Solarpunk is. The punk element to it and the solar element probably kind of gonna give some ideas, and you can visualize some stuff, just like you would be with cyberpunk or fusion punk or steampunk. Not to drop just a few keywords, which kind of like maybe gonna give. But what is Solarpunk ultimately?
As a concept, Solarpunk, well, first it's a term that emerged at the beginning of the 2010s, something like that, as a term, but it's something that existed like prior to the definition of the emergence of the term itself. So there's a lot of artists and writers and authors and many people that contributed to this movement before even the name came, right? Usually it features self-sufficient cities, towns, right? In terms of energy. So it's close to steampunk in that concept that we take one technological aspect specifically and we use it as a focal point, and we see what if it constrains the society in a way where it changes how the society work, right? Or how it's organized. And so steampunk did that with the steam engine, and solarpunk do that in a sense with solar panels and other forms of renewable energies. So usually you see solar panels in solarpunk artworks, but you see also like a lot of wind turbines and stuff like that that produce, like, that creates this idea that the city or the design space is self-sufficient in terms of energy. There's also like a lot of organic and green vegetation features
Yeah,
in
it's
cities.
it's it's always
Yeah,
overgrown. It's
it's
that's
yes.
where, like, if you type Solarpunk, it's always like it's less about the city to me, but more like a farmland almost. Like it's a very green.
Usually in the visuals, there's this kind of mixture between the farm and this idea of returning to some kind of basics, doing the work, but doing the work for being self-sufficient as a human being. Like, so the farm becomes this kind of idealization of what it means to be autonomous, right? As a small group of people, like you produce what you need for yourself, right? So this kind of idea in that, but the city is usually not that far away. So there's a city which is embedded in the landscape. So point of reference, but it's not the only way to look at solarpunk. So you have, like, if you look like for solarpunk cities, you have a lot of organic features in the design of the city. You find some kind of renaissance or a new wave of art nouveau in the way that the architecture is made, right? And there's a lot of connection with the soft mobility movements, because usually the cities are features like less cars. They are walkable cities for most of them. There are space for people and vegetation and animals, which is also, like, all of these things are aesthetics features that makes solarpunk as a visual concept, right? If we stay on at this level, this could be just seen as gimmicks, right? Because it's not that original. But there's another notion of solar in solarpunk, right? Is the kind of light and hopefulness, or hopeful vision, optimistic vision of the future. So solar stands for the technology, but it stands also for this kind of better future that's that you can see. And usually the narratives beyond the pure aesthetics of the solarpunk narratives and the kind of stories that are written around this concept, they are generally speaking optimistic about the future. Although they talk about challenges and crises and stuff like that, they are rather optimistic in how they treat the subject. So it's not a dystopia, right? Solarpunk
Yeah.
stories are not dystopian in any way. Even like we could say they are an answer to dystopian stories and the kind of pessimistic kind of narratives you can find in the mainstream media in
Yeah.
general. Like when you talk about the future, people, like, it's easy, and it's kind of, it's became a trope, right? In a sense, like, you talk about the future and everyone can imagine a future where the human society collapsed, where we had to make like hard choices. Like, it's kind of obvious right now if you talk about the future, right? There's this kind of future with high tech, where we are mixed together with the tech, but also where we lost something in the process, right? Rather the space, or rather our own humanity, or something else, right? So this is where the dystopian aspect comes in play, and solarpunk is an answer to that in a way. It wants to reject this idea that the future is necessarily some kind of zero-sum game for humanity.
You're referring to like the cyberpunk. Do you see it as a counterpoint to that?
It's a counterpoint to cyberpunk for sure, but I would say first it's just a counterpoint to what I called the mundanity of the mini ends of the world, which is not necessarily linked to cyberpunk itself, because you can find like a lot of stories or kind of narratives that are about the future and that are pessimistic and that are about some kind of like a form of end of the world for humanity, at least, but that is not this, like, that doesn't have any relationship with cyberpunk per se, right? So you can make the distinction, but the two, like, cyberpunk tries to address the two in two different ways. So the first is not seeing the future as a dystopian vision of the future, like where humanity lusts against, quotes, nature as a shapeless, right, a concept, because most of the time, a way to treat nature in stories today is some kind of external force that is not, we are not part of nature, we are external to nature, right? And it's kind of external force that manifests through catastrophic events. Usually humanity needs to come back like some kind of to some kind of primal state where we have to survive, and nature gets back or takes revenge on us. So there's this kind of paradigm where it's a dichotomy, right? Where we are external to nature, and we took something from nature, and nature takes it back, right? And this is kind of a revenge story. Well, in the article, I talk about that and the fact that it's highly connected to biblical stories and this kind of narrative talking point that are existing in society in general today. And this idea of that there's necessarily a degrading aspect to the passage of time, that time is a bad thing, that it degrades what we create as humans, and that the only way to change that is to fight back against this degradation, right? To be in an active state of interventionism against it, and this is what we call innovation, and this is basically preventing and undoing the passage of time, and that requires us to see in entities a form of salvation. Like an entity can be the savior, the great savior of this situation, of this crisis, against our fight against this degradation, right? And the entity can be a person, or it can be a product or a solution. And like if you think about this way, like it's interesting to see how it connects to a form of narrative that exists today in technology and in economy, where this kind of techno-solutionism aspect of the narrative either try to put some figures as the great saviors, or the technology itself as the great savior. And this is where you can see a connection with cyberpunk itself, because cyberpunk, when it was invented, was a criticism of technology itself. Right, nowadays it became so mainstream that it lost this meaning. Right, it's cool. It's used to sell technology, basically shifted from the punk narrative to the mainstream. But yeah, I don't want to go necessarily in a long tangent. We can discuss about cyberpunk itself, because there's a lot of interesting concept. But
because it's such a stark contrast between Solarpunk and cyberpunk in particular. But even those two, or maybe fusion punk is a bit closer. Some people probably are aware of Fallout games, which have been really massive back in the day. And the game itself, and I'm just gonna kind of cover like a very very small segment of it, but the narrative there has always been that there was a really good side, like almost like a dichotomy of its own with fusion punk. The perfect world where everything is run by fusion: cars, personal assistants, gardening tools, like everything had a fusion core in it, like every single element, which is super basic. However, the world simply shifted, nuclear war started and things of that nature, and now it's kind of like a dystopia type of thing. So it's always has been like almost like a comparison. Okay, it could go really well if it's managed well, however likely it's not gonna go that well. And I think cyberpunk has also been kind of positioned that way. There's a lot of excitement of I don't know, like body enhancement, augmentation of skills, abilities, stuff like that, like the systems which are bulletproof because of a purely digital backgrounds and like cyberspace. But then it's shifting into hacking, corruption, politics, injustices, stuff like that. Like all that's like it's almost like every single movement brings possibility of a really bright future and also possibility of a really really bad future. Did you see any of that in Solarpunk? Because it's so outlined so positively, but like I wonder what could actually be opposite of that.
I define Solarpunk as the concept of this optimistic future, right? I told you that there's two ways to look at it. So if you look at the concept itself, it's not supposed to be to embed some form of dichotomy because it's optimistic, right? But if you look at it from an assemblage of narratives and themes and stuff like that, and what is today in the present elements of Solarpunk that you could find, then yes, there is such things, and you can find appropriation of Solarpunk ideas by either corporations or venture capitalists that want to use this narrative that is appealing to a lot of people because they want to break free from a system that feels remove their sense of meaning creation and the sense of autonomy, and so they want to use that, to exist within the Solarpunk ideas, and they appropriate the idea and they propose something that is contradictory to what Solarpunk tries to do, but use all the features and the visual aspects of it nonetheless. A great example that is recent is California Forever. I don't know if you know this project. So I don't know if it's a venture capitalist firm or some investors that wanted to buy some lands. I think it's near San Francisco, and create a new city there, entirely autonomous, entirely self-sufficient as in terms of energy, and walkable, and with no cars and stuff like that. So you here you have like all the talking points of Solarpunk, but it's proposed by a system that is the system that Solarpunk tries to escape, right? It's a subversion of it, especially when you know where comes the money and what they did to actually build the project. So they bought some lands that are used to produce food today, and they want to build a city from scratch there. This is not a Solarpunk proposition. It's the opposite of what it tries to do. Buying lands, removing farms and creating something from scratch is not the idea. A city that will then be a project of an economical project, in the sense that it will aim to, well, people will try to get money back, at some point. So how does it make money, and to what ends, are the kind of questions that Solarpunk criticize. So this kind of subversion of the theme. The fact is that Solarpunk is not that recent as a concept, but it's not really yet clear. Like, there's not you asked the question earlier, there's no central point. There's no one way to understand it. There's not one way to define it. The reason for that is that you find in Solarpunk a lot of ideas related to decentralization of power, and this idea of especially distribution power and decision to more local and human-sized contexts. I mean, I don't think people that are really into Solarpunk want a central authority to say what is Solarpunk and what it should be, and have like this clearly defined concept, because then it will lose this ability to be many things at the same time, right? So this is where it's contradictory a bit, because you need a definition to understand Solarpunk and what it proposed, but it's not only that. And if you look at who are close to the Solarpunk movements, you have like a lot of different communities that are doing a lot of different things, from communities in the soft mobility movements, walkable cities, new form of urbanisms, architecture, arts, literature, whatever. Like you have like even social sciences. So you have like a lot of different communities of sometimes professionals, sometimes people that are just passionate about the subject, and they do their things on their side. They know that there's other communities. Some people are part of many, but there's not like a willingness to put everything in the middle and say, hey, let's do this big thing that is Solarpunk, right? So
that's my kind of perception has been as well, because it's also like, I mean, I don't know how you feel about this notion, but like from vision perspective, or maybe ontological design, it's or maybe a lot of other like speculative type of elements. If the futures you think about or talk about or write about are likely gonna like our actual future is gonna resemble of that. So like it's quite important to talk, like, let's say the people who talk about cyberpunk and all the different bits or technology, or they just simply call it tech, movement, likely are gonna be the ones making it happen. The people working in tech, obsessing with tech, are probably going to continue and create a future where tech is first. And likewise, people who probably going to think about sustainable futures, planet centricity, again, Solarpunk, are likely going to be the ones who are going to infuse ideas and then shape. But the challenge with that, and do challenge me too on this, but is we're likely still going to end up in this turmoil, or this mixture, this yarn ball with different colors. Of course, it might not be a bad thing whatsoever, but I feel like it's yet one facet. Like there almost cannot be just one future, like, because we cannot clean reset
I do pretty much agree with you. I won't speak for everyone in Solarpunk movements because I don't know everyone in the Solarpunk movements, but for the few I exchange with, I think they are pretty conscious of this as well. Like they don't want a narrow version of a future that they have in their mind, but they want to participate in creating a better version of the future that they think is necessary, at least at their local, in their local context, like where they live and where they interact the most, right? This is the difference with the narrative around technology in general, which tends to be globalized, right? That we want something to be the best for everyone everywhere at the same time, and this is something that you cannot find in Solarpunk, basically, because as I told you, like this idea of distribution and a local context is something that this is something that is really important, and so this contradicts this aspect. But I do pretty much agree with you that it will be a mixture. I find it's actually a good thing personally. One of the aspects of Solarpunk that is connected to future thinking and this kind of movement is this idea that first the future is actually the present unfolding, right? So you don't have like a certainty about what it will become, and so all the action in the present will influence the future. And so it's why it's important when you think about the future to be in the present, to be in the now, and to be active in the now, which seems to be a contradiction in itself, but actually if you think of the future as something that is constantly unfolding, makes totally sense. And you want diversity. You don't want to lose that diversity. And I can take an example, like in evolutionary algorithms, they create population of individuals with a pool of genes and stuff like that, and they try to see how the population evolve given some ecological constraints. And when you run the algorithm, you can find yourself in some what we call local suboptima or local optima, where actually the diversity of in the population of genes just collapsed it, and only the individuals express only certain genes that succeeding in their environment, but it make the whole population more fragile to any external events. And actually to escape this kind of situation, researchers have to introduce a diversity again in the gene pool to make sure that the population can survive longer, because otherwise it just collapses or it goes into an exponential but hyper fragile, right? And you don't want that, actually, because then it will consume resources and kill itself, basically. Just to say, like, you can take evolution as a learning to what you need as dynamics and constraints in designing the future. You want diversity, you want to create some constraints, but you don't want to define it too much, because then it will necessarily lose any form of diversity, right?
It's also like, maybe it's, the narrative's playing in my head, but I was thinking about almost like, okay, if you want Solarpunk features, which are, like monolith type of approach, where you don't have much kind of like diversity or modularization from other aspects or narratives, like you almost need to do freedom fighting approach. And maybe that's what you could categorize those just stop oil movements, which are quite large across the globe, like that type of thing. I feel like I don't know if it's the right thing to call them radical forces, where people kind of step out and try to fight for that future, but still, like, I'm sure it's quite incremental at that. It's, you can't, like, we have this systems which just can't be rewired that easily. You kind of have to almost pick out different parts and then
Yes.
rebuild and do so, like, continuously.
Yeah, well, in the article, I quote something that Morpheus says in the Matrix movie, when he presents the Matrix and what they try to do to Neo. He says that the system is what they are fighting against, but when you are in the system, what you see is the mind of the people that you are trying to save, but they are so attached to how the system works that sometimes you have to fight them as well to liberate them, basically. And well, this is the message of rebellion and as well as activism, right? So what you say about being a bit radical in your approach is, I feel, connects to punk narratives in general, all of them are a form of rebellion against of a mainstream system. That's so usually they approach it as a criticism of the system, of the kind of unintended but bad consequences that the system generates. And then they are radical in the sense that they want to be radical to be noticed in a way, right? To be visible. And this is where it's kind of a weird place to be, I would say, anyway. So I'm not an activist, but you want something better and greater for everyone, but at the same time you make a choice to potentially do some things that might go against any form of ethical way of doing some things, right? To make this change happen, right? And so yeah, you need to live with this kind of contradiction in your personal ethics, right? I would say designers are not necessarily activists, but they can be activists if they want to, and then they will have to deal with this kind of consideration as well.
I agree as well. Like, to me, designers are changers, basically. And, any evolution or any activism requires change. Quite frankly, there's no one else as good at finding out issues than almost designers, because that's what we're wired. But that's the only thing to add to
Yes,
that.
but most designers still remain in, like, they don't necessarily question the system. They question an aspect of the system, but I'm not really convinced that we could say that designers are changing this. I mean, they are bringing change, I agree, but within the confine of the existing system. And it is even truer, I would say, when you work only on tech, because tech is the expression of the system we are in. Right? It's hyper transactional. It's meant to be an extension of the social and political system we are living in. And because of that, changing the tech is not necessarily changing the system itself, right? So I would say it's where it's a, if you really want to be an activist, and I'm not calling anyone to necessarily be an activist, right? People do what they want to do, but if you want to be an activist, you cannot just do what designers usually do, or what they are taught to do. I would say you need to be a bit further than that, and this is where it's I would say it's difficult to actually want to change the system. It's more difficult than doing design as we are taught to do, I would say.
Yeah, and you have to have the right perspectives. But to pick up on something you said, which was specific to technology, and in my mind, I guess maybe it's talking about the Solarpunk too. It's designers to me there or everywhere also are architects, also are kind of civil engineers, also are engineers, because inevitably people design things. Like even someone who's working on, let's say, something like social sciences are basically designing the processes and touch points of how to iterate with different people or how things work basically on human level. Like, everyone's ultimately a designer, and I know people might kind of conflate this with everyone's a UX designer. That's not what I mean. Like, but everyone designs decisions basically, or they make some sort of choices to do better things. This is where I think it doesn't matter where, and please challenge me, but it doesn't matter who you are or what profession your specialty or hat you wear. Let's say architects who would take on Solarpunk ideas, they would still design it within very limited constraints. I saw this example the other day. Maybe it's something you shared actually, where the garden cities, which is more so like civil engineering and city mapping and architecture combined, have been one of the big movements, I guess, coming out from Solarpunk ideas. In UK, I've been to one which is well in Garden City, but reality is a bit kind of, it's not as ideal because it's designed on those fundamental principles of, okay, with this, it's all circular, it's all sustainable, super green, but after years and years of adding industrial stuff around it, adding more suburbs, you still end up with a city with just more parks ultimately. And that's where I think it's kind of like, it doesn't matter how you approach it, it's very limiting. Is it something which you observed as well, that it's kind of like if you would just take Solarpunk ideas and you would want to redesign something, it's likely going to be small, or it's likely going to be kind of like community sized, maybe would be better.
Yes,
label.
I think it's something that is by design of Solarpunk, that you don't want to have like some form of standardized approach and globalized approach to how to do things. Yes, it's limiting, but the idea behind is like if a lot of communities of different sizes do some similar things, on the larger scale, it does actually produce better conditions than not doing that, right? So that's the idea. So you have to see it like in two different rhythm. Like it's the first the local aspect, and then how the local aspect influence the larger aspects, right? Which is not something that most people are trying to do, I would say, and especially in design, we see first the object and the immediate interactions with it, but we stop there, right? We don't go any further. I'm not saying that any kind of Solarpunk inspired projects necessarily aim to do that, because most of them are just sometimes just gimmicks, unfortunately, especially in architecture. You have like huge buildings with green everywhere, and cool, but this is not because you have the aesthetics of Solarpunk that you do Solarpunk, in a sense, because you just mimic the feature of it. You don't really think of what does that imply in its local context. Perhaps you wouldn't build a building at all if you if you look at what you want to do in a Solarpunk context, right? If you look at a broader scale, perhaps the aim is to do some small changes here and there and see how it does influence the larger scale. Give you an example. Yeah, you don't come from a car-centric city to a workable city in one day, right? You need to do small changes everywhere, and over time it improves the city. But it's not possible to just do like tabula rasa approach where you just destroy everything and rebuild everything. I mean, it's exactly the problem with the forever California forever city, right? Where you start from scratch because you think like starting from scratch is the best approach, because yes, you have less constraint. Then you forget about the context itself, right? Where people live, and where people live is not in a place that doesn't exist, is in the existing cities, and what kind of things you can start to do in this place to improve it, right? And you have this movement that try to create green space in the city where it was not supposed to be. I don't remember the name of they just
Oh yeah, I remember that. Yeah,
what's the
reusing the bleak spaces for
yes.
I can't remember the label, but I know exactly what you mean, where they used it for like allotments and gardens, or even to grow food, I think.
Yes,
Like
they
there
plant
was a bit of that. Yeah.
vegetables, and people in the from the local community can just pick them up and use it to cook stuff. I mean, it's a form of activism because it's illegal in a way, right? So it's a kind of rebellion act, but it's to show people that it's possible to change the space in which they live, right? And an urbanist looking at this could be inspired and say, okay, let's create spaces where people can actually do this kind of thing, right? Open up possibilities for people to have not only place to live but place to interact, which is something that car-centric cities like lost, right? You have less space for people to interact. You have more space for people to just commute to places and to park cars. So you don't change all of that in one day, right? But you can start like removing parking spots. Yes, people will not everyone will be happy with this at first, but then instead of just having like these empty spaces, you use it to create a place where people can actually interact in a better way with their local neighborhood or communities. Place for kids to play, and over time, if there's place for kids to play, then we want to make the street even safer for them. So you restrict access to cars, you build space for pedestrians, you build space for bikes and stuff like that. And over time, you end up with a walkable place. I'm not saying you don't need cars, at all, but there's an overabundance of place for cars, compared to humans. Yeah, you do that in one place,
Yeah.
you do that in another place. That at some point you want to connect these two places together, so you have to do it for an entire street. And over 10 years, maybe you end up with a walkable city. But it takes time. That's for
But
sure.
I'm very conflicted for it. Maybe I want to challenge you a bit on One thing which kind of like I get where Solarpunk is coming from as I guess a collection of narratives or the way people describe a concept, but it's always focused on cities. And granted, that's where the most of the people, most of the population is, but
Yes.
every time I look at the concepts of Solarpunk, and again, maybe it's more criticism of actual concepts than ideas or what we're discussing, but to me it appears like a village which has maybe a couple of families, but it expanded beyond what we needed. It's all like cognizant of the amount, the population, the community size, that in reality those cities which are shown to have a few wind turbines, solar panels everywhere, massive fields and greenery and things of that nature would triple or 10x, or like they would have to be so massive to actually support those populations. And I get your point as well that okay, yeah, not necessarily what's gonna happen, or realistic, that you're gonna start small, you're gonna end up at the better areas. But I feel like maybe that's where the shortcoming is of the movement. It's kind of like portraying something as way too utopic, and again, you could argue vision and stuff like that matters, but
I think it has to be said, I'm not a proponent of Solarpunk. I'm fascinated by the topic. I want to talk about it because I want to be inspired. I'm not saying we should aim for a Solarpunk, future as it is shown in the beautiful artworks you can find, because I do agree with you. It's like, it's not, I don't think this kind of future, it will be the future we will have anyway, right? I don't think Solarpunk is an utopia. I don't believe that. And why that is, it's not a cohesive proposal. It's not something that is sound enough to have like legs and work on its way. It's to me, it's a collection of ideas and principles and narrative and stuff like that. To me, it's actually better framed this way. And I like to think that Solarpunk itself is an imaginary for transition, to move away from the current system to another one, which we don't know which one it is. There's no formulation of what is this new system, right? But it's not the one we have now. That's the actual proposition, is an antithesis to it says basically it's not the system we have right now. It doesn't work on the long run, right? The system we have right now. So we have to change. To change it, we need new imaginary. We need new ideas. We need new ways of understanding the world and designing in it, right? So that's, to me, it's the true proposition of Solarpunk, is beneath the surface, is exactly that. It doesn't say what should be things. And this is where, to me, it's not an utopia. And basically, an utopia is utopia comes from topos in Latin, and topos is the territory, and so utopia it's actually no place, it's no territory. So an utopia, by definition, is something that has no place, but we want to reach it anyway, right? I don't know if it's utopia, and to this definition, it's not. It's not, to me. It's not a no place, because if you look at the movements involved in Solarpunk, they are really in the present. The thing is, like, if you take a movement like Strong Towns or stuff like that in the US, they try to show to city makers that it's totally possible to create mixed-use places where you create a lot of diversity, and this increase the value of land, this increase the value, the economical aspect of cities, because most cities in America are just losing money every year, because they just expanded the city, like you said, suburbs and roads everywhere. This is a way of doing Solarpunk, right? In a sense, it's in the practice is to say, well, we need more mixed-use places. In Europe, we have more mixed-use places, although we were influenced by the US for some of the recent construction. I would say we have, like, because of how medieval cities were built, have a lot of mixed-use places, and these are actually the places that people want to live in the most, right? It shows the value, and we can do that kind of things without necessarily having like this kind of beautiful artworks end results. And this will be closer to what Solarpunk aims to do, basically, that's having the artwork like taking it and seeing the landscape and say, yeah, we did it. It's all green and solar panels everywhere. Good job.
Yeah, just the picture does tell the story of 1,000 words. So it matters for narratives. I think the
Yes.
visualization is so important. Even like, I don't think words would do that justice. Maybe a lot of the listeners might like, it's fascinating, as probably not as much as for you, but I'm still like very appreciative of that, especially from, I guess, service design lens. A lot of these ideas, let's say, if you as a designer would just take on that picture or definitions or principles, if you're obviously proactive, you're able to kind of trickle it down to a specific design decisions, or even, let's say, I don't know, like how the services are combined. But how do you imagine, let's say, a UXer coming into this concept or into these narratives, this assemblage of ideas, and kind of being able to do better in daily situations? Like, do you have any examples of what that could look like?
What you said prior to that is like, it sounds to be highly focused on cities, and obviously it's not where most designers work. Like, we're not all working on cities, and this is where I would say my design principles comes from, to try to extract some of the what makes Solarpunk, taking out from what it says, basically, which is most of what it says is related to the designed space and the physical design space, right? And we are not all working on this kind of stuff, and making less about the space itself, but dynamics and kind of constraints we want to put in place to achieve the same kind of results, or the same kind of ideals that Solarpunk is trying to say. And I think one of the main aspects of Solarpunk is, what it says is that we should be less focused on the object that we are designing, on the technology itself, on, like, designers are really, well, we are making products for most of us, right? Either like physical objects or digital objects, and we are really focused on that, right? And what Solarpunk is saying is, well, the object is cool, but clearly it's not sufficient to make the change we want to see. So what we need to do, in fact, is to focus on actually what we want to change, in a given context, in a given space. What you actually want to do is change how people interact, either together or interact with other people or with organizations and stuff like that, and actually think of this specific context and how you want to influence it to make this context like better in a way, right? And not being focused on the object, but what kind of objects are or technology is necessary for the change to happen in this specific context, and then do only the object when you believe it's the right way to to actually change this context. It's a bit less like standardized in a way, which is kind of contradictory to what we do with technology usually, right? We want it to work everywhere the same way, in an ideal way, for the best for everyone. Here it's a bit different. You probably want to do certain things in a specific context in a certain way, and do certain different things in a different way in another context, right? To give you an example, I worked in the finance space, and we had this a product that enabled teams to work together and to actually treat some kind of cases, like it was a case management tool. And people believed the issue was the software itself, like was the piece of technology. But we did go into the physical place where people work. We try to understand what people are trying to achieve, how they interact together, how they will pass information to another team, to another individual, map out all these interactions, and then only says, now what we need to do is to change how they interact together. The technology is irrelevant for now. Let's see later what we will do with this piece of technology. The main issues are when they try to interact between two teams, something is missing, something is not working, right? So we did like a bunch of prototypes, from a chat to even just phone calls, to see how it will influence how they transmit information. Guess what? Phone calls works better than chats, and we ended up designing a way for them to first put in place a ritual within the teams to make sure that they are used to transmit the right information at the right time to the right team for the right purposes. So they have like some kind of routine in place to make sure that it becomes like a habit, right, to do that, because it's a bank. Everything is secret. Not everyone wants to share anything with other teams if they don't have to. So you had to break this kind of secrecy mentality to, in a way, to make sure that the right information is transmitted at the right time. And only then we worked on the software and we say, now we do changes so it reflects what is needed in this specific context. But then, it was like actually made for that and only for that and for a specific team. I don't know if it would work for another context totally different from that, but it worked pretty well there, right? So this is an example. You change the medium you design, actually. You don't design the software so it changes people. You design the medium for people to change their way to interact together. And if software is the right way to crystallize the medium, then it is. But if it's not, you can, like, phone calls worked, just to say. So you could do
definitely.
just that.
It's such a good example too. Like the worst to me would be if someone is listening or reading about Solarpunk and they just then decide to go and make a mixed reality or VR experience of Solarpunk. Well, maybe actually that's not the worst example what could happen. Maybe you need that to communicate the ideas and kind of spark interest from, the world. But it's a lot of ways to skin it, I guess. But it's kind of like not just aim too high, I guess, but kind of keep it as a vision and then walk back of what could be done next. One last thing, I guess, which might be interesting for the audience is the actual principles, which you outlined pretty well. But I wonder if you could kind of give a bit of a context of why do you think that's kind of important for Solarpunk, and especially UXers looking at Solarpunk?
So I have like 5 principles that I extracted from Solarpunk. First draft, high level principles. So I need to revisit them at some point to make them a bit more concrete. But they capture what is important to understand from Solarpunk. So the first one is to design scaffolds for growth and diversity. And the idea here is so a scaffold is this kind of structure that help grow or construct stuff, and you can see behind, like, this is something found in nature as well. How it is connected to Solarpunk is what we discussed today, is a lot of things related to diversity and to the way you want this diversity for the future, but you want also to put constraints to direct this diversity in a certain way. So this first principle is really about that. Is about how you can not design an object, but design circumstances to increase the likelihood of certain outcomes, right? So this is the first principle. So the second one is affordances for local experiences. This one comes to this idea in Solarpunk to scale down things to a human size experience or a community size experience. And to do that, you don't focus on the object, you focus on the context and how you can help people see affordances. So affordances are the kind of things you see in this this picture here. Here it's a playground, and you see there's ways for people to hide, to climb, to slide, and these are clues in the context that you can do stuff actually in this playground. And so you could see designing for context, like the example I give you with these 2 teams that needed to work together, how you create affordances for them to be able to do that in an efficient and effective way, right? So that's the second principle. The third one is about something that we didn't really discuss today, but is about more than human experiences. So a lot of stories in Solarpunk are about giving back or giving a place to other living organisms in our design space, and especially like animals, right? Like if you are working on tech, obviously it can be a bit difficult to see how to do that, but I think there's a place to say designers need to think beyond the human needs. Cool, that's important to understand human needs, but if they go against, I would say, the needs of the environment or the needs of other animals, perhaps you need to also think about their needs and design an experience where humans are included, but also the other animals. So it's replacing I would say, it's not replacing human-centered design, but it's extending it to the rest of the ecosystem.
Maybe to add, and I'm coming from the session of Samuel Huber earlier in the year on planet-centric design, he was describing it as actors, basically, which also could be inanimate objects. It
Yes.
could be a river, let's say, which you need to design with, or a lake, or trees, or boulders, like something which not necessarily is a carbon form, like something which has no life, so to speak, but has like a big meaning to to the communities, which should be
Yes.
protected. It could be a lot of different elements to this.
I agree, and we discussed that together with Samuel, and this is where I see a lot of connection with his approach. Here, it's not just considering them or designing specifically for them, but you could say, like for instance, a lot of the tech we create are for humans and give them a means of control over the environment. And some of the Solarpunk stories, they ask what if we shift the focus and we gave animals, for instance, means to connect with us. So they have means of control on us, but in a way where it's kind of shared, where it's equally beneficial. And some stories talk about technology that helps like animals to communicate with us, for instance, and give us clues on what they need or what they want. So that could be an idea. Like, what if you design something not for humans, but for another species that would benefit us as well? That's an interesting question, and I'm sure that this is not something that is necessarily pretty well explored today. Something that I feel is a really strong principle, and to me it's an ethical principle, is to design for human and non-human autonomy, and this idea of bringing people a means to make decisions for themselves, to orient themselves in their own way, the way they decided is relevant to them, instead of deciding for them what is good for themselves, right? So this is a strong principle to me. It is really, really highly connected to previous ones, and I could talk about this one like a lot, but I will stop there. But it's also really, really highly connected to all the AI discussions and AI technology as well. So I think it could be like a discussion on its own.
Yeah.
And the last one is I talk about designing, the need for what we call multi-ontological approach, which means basically that you need to take into account multiple perspectives in your design. And we are kind of trying to do that, but we have also an issue in the process of doing that, because we are trying to synthesize those perspectives into one single cohesive view, and this is an issue. Well, at least I think it is an issue. And how do you design for what we can call worlds within worlds, different worldviews, without um, you know averaging those views, or deciding what aspect of those views are necessarily relevant. And one of the issue in the process of design of the design process doing that is that the level of interpretation of the context is still at the level of the designer. The designer decide what is relevant for the different contexts and the different people that perspective that they encounter. And this idea of designing for worlds within worlds, it comes from a revolutionary movement in Mexico, that from a community that was not part of, for a long time. They were excluded from any decision in the country, and this movement is called the Zapatistas movement. And they decided at some point to rebel against this exclusion and do a march on the city, on the capital, but in a non-violent way. So they were this, dressed up like terrorists, but instead of weapons, they had like musical instruments. And they went to the capital, and they played music, and they did a lot of basically of noise to to attract attention and say we are part of this country as well. Well, the leader of this movement said this, that this is happy army. This is in this revolution dancing against the rigueur. And he called all the people participating in the movement like mediators of dreams and sorrows that pass through this gateway of the worlds within worlds, as a metaphor of their world where they were excluded from the other world, which is the other world they are part of but excluded from, which is the country they live in. and that doing what they are doing, this revolution that they are doing, connects the two in a way where they are still existing as two distinct worlds, but with a lot of relation between them. And so we need to do exactly that as well. We need to create a process that allows us to keep these worlds as they are, make connections between them, so we can design for the connections and not, design for what we think these worlds needs.
Yeah.
And
And that, I
yeah.
guess, would allow people to actually connect the dots. Or my interpretation is also kind of design more deeply inclusive
Yes.
experiences. Or when I say experiences, it's everything from economics to politics to decision making to equity and equality within the society and things of that nature. I feel like that's what it kind of touches.
It means also that you have to find a way where the kind of design decisions that you make is not necessarily you to make, is to let the people, which are in their worlds, that live in their worlds, that live in that have their perspectives, to make decisions, and you build upon their decisions instead of making decisions for them, which is not an easy process to unfold. And it's actually there's not much things that exist on that. The close proximity in terms of process that exists is a pluriversal design, but here again they have like some issues where the level of interpretation of what is required and what is needed for the design within the design process is still made at the level of designer. So what we try to do with the multi-ocean strategy framework, for instance, is to bring back this level of interpretation at the level of the participants, for instance. So that would be an example how you could do it. Like, it's still open to be discussed and to be designed as a process, so, which is something I find interesting.
That's awesome. And thank you so much for coming in and sharing your thoughts and also sharing the principles, because that's like a perfect note to, I guess, wrap the episode too. It's quite actionable as well. Like, for those listening, please take a look. Perhaps we can share a link to your article where the principles are, or to the slides or things of that nature.
Yeah, my LinkedIn is so you can find me, Kevin Richards, on LinkedIn. You can find the article on Medium as well. So if you look for what can designer learn from Solarpunk, there's not many articles about Solarpunk, so you might find it quite easily. And I link in this article, there's a link to a page where there's all the resources, all the articles, all the content I read to create this, to write down this article. So there's a lot of things to read if you want to explore further the subject there. So yeah, go ahead and dive in this this weird
Awesome.
and strange world.
No, it's awesome, and yeah, like makes you think about stuff which is less tech, I guess, obsessed, and yeah, it's awesome. But thank you so much. Thanks again.
Thank you.